Okay. Welcome, friends. It is our last lecture of week 1. Can you guys believe it? We have already crushed a week of lectures and learning and growth and happiness and joy. And it's all honestly because React is legit and it's dope. So we're excited about that. We've got quite a few things to learn and walk through today. We're going to, before we do that, let me settle down. Just algorithms get me jazzed. Okay. 2 things for housekeeping. You've got discussion questions due Sunday. Make sure you do those. Please, please, please do not make me have to email you and say, hey, you don't have discussion questions, you knucklehead. What are you doing? So please make sure you do those. They're already open. The next 4 weeks are already open. I'm just blatantly telling you, go do all 4 of them. Save yourself the stress and the anger of forgetting it. Give yourself 15 minutes to knock them out. Cool. Other than that, you've got 3 core assignments this week. You've got predict destructuring. You've got convert to arrow and prop it up. We have talked about destructuring first class. We talked about arrow functions, and somebody, can't remember exactly who it is, so please take credit in chat if this was you, but somebody put a really cool article about arrow functions. Love how much you guys are helping each other. So there is one in Discord. If you're not already in Discord, you should have emailed me and let me know that. But arrow functions, there's another thing in there, but we did talk about these yesterday in class. And then the last one you have is prop it up. We are going to talk about props today. That's part of what we're doing. So that is exciting. A little bit about what we talked about last week. Wow, that was a stage manager locking in. Or what we talked about last class is we talked about the difference, just a slight difference of ES5 and ES6. Right, we talked about really some of the things like arrow functions and let var const and kind of the difference between those. We also, again, we talked about arrow functions and versus function declarations. There's going to be a word that I say today. It's called syntactic sugar. I asked our AI overlord for a better example of syntactic sugar. And really what it was talking about was it is a way that we can write code in a simpler way, and JavaScript itself will do some of the heavier lifting for us. You can think of, and it gave this as an example, and ChatGPT is way smarter than I am, is it gave arrow functions as a example of syntactic sugar for functions. They do handle things a little bit differently, but what you can really think about it is an easier way. It is syntactic sugar for declaring a function, right? And it's a little bit simpler way for us to write it, though it might not seem simple because it's new to us. It is, in fact, a simpler way for us to write functions and also handle functions, and it's not as stressful and or intensive than us actually declaring or using function declarations. Yesterday, we also talked about the Lego thing. I gave an example of, like, I was even thinking about it today. Like if you have like a Fortnite character where basically you have one character, but you just change the skin back and forth, or Legos, right? We talked about single page application and the power of React using components to do something like that. Instead of having to go and load a whole bunch of different HTML pages, we talked that, hey, we can actually just use React, keep the same one, right? Keep the same index.html and just take off what we don't want and add in what we do want. So we're going to dive into that today. So there is quite a bit that we are doing, right? Quite a bit that we talked about yesterday. And so if you missed that, that is in our class schedule. We also talked about terminal basics and GitHub yesterday. And so you can find, as always, lecture here. If office hour is recorded like this past one was, I'll make sure that I put those right here, and our class lectures are here. You can also find lectures at this lecture recording and within our actual like platform. It's there. And I showed you guys yesterday where the archived classes were. So there's plenty of spaces for you to get your recordings. Just a little bit of a view into what we're going to do next week. We're going to continue to expand on our knowledge of React. We're going to talk about arguably the most important things, or kind of the real functionality of React. If you guys can understand this is really going to help you. It's called hooks. Hooks are going to be tools that we can use within React, use state. And there's another one that I will probably teach you on Tuesday. It's called a use effect. It is hidden in the API section of the platform. I hate that we do it that way. So just so you know, yeah, it is in this section right here. It's called use effect. I think it's the worst placement, transparently, but it is a tool that we are going to learn and use. And I'll probably teach you that on Tuesday, and then we'll expand on it when we actually get into APIs. So that is what we can expect next week. We're going to look at forms. We're actually going to create forms and figure out what we can do, and then using state and sort of submitting some information really to our state, not to database yet, but submitting some information and kind of creating some state there. And then once we have all that stuff submitted and created, we're going to see how do we iterate through that and show it. We're going to use this tool called map, which is kind of like under the hood. It's just a for loop, but it's .map that allows us to iterate through a whole bunch of stuff and actually visualize and show it. That's going to be a big, big thing for us to learn when you get to the belt exam. You're going to have to know how to map through stuff. So we're going to make sure we do that map and filter as well. There's not going to be a Gray's hour next week because Gray is off on Wednesday and Thursday. They are, I think, traveling or something. But the following week, we will start implementing a Gray's hour. So that way Gray can come in and kind of give you guys another perspective of teaching as well. So it's not just me droning on 24/7. Cool. Any questions on anything we've done before we just jump into class and what we need to look at? Got a little bit of stuff to do. Don't worry, you will not forget, because I see, Logan, you said if I do them all now, I'm going to forget how to do them in 5 weeks. Yeah, that's true. I mean, maybe, but just lock it in. Just do it. You know, week 4, I'll lock it in and I'll open up weeks 5 through 8. So I promise discussion questions, I'm very simple on those. Okay. So what I want to talk about first and foremost is we talked a little bit about Babel and syntactic. Well, we didn't talk about syntactic sugar, but I want to talk about Babel and how that works. So again, when we are talking about React is going to use this thing called JSX, right? And that is what we call, it's just a syntax extension. JSX provides what we call syntactic sugar, or all you can think about it as, or you need to think about it as, is a simpler way to write a more complicated piece of code, right? And so instead of us having to go in and manipulate the DOM and do a whole bunch of stuff like this, right? We can use JSX to convey what we want to do. And JSX will then use this tool called Babel. And I believe you can go to babel.com and write in like an H1 hello world, and you'll see it convert it to JavaScript. So it'll convert it to where you want it to go on the DOM. It'll do all of this information, right? And then that way our browser can read what we're wanting to do. So JSX is really kind of like your interpreter. Let's say if you're going to another country that you don't speak the language, JSX allows us to say what we want to do in an easier way, maybe our spoken language. They will then go and translate it to, some other person in their specific language that they understand. Right. So Babel it's a transpiler, but you can think about it like a translator, right? It's going to allow us to write some HTML in our code, and then it will convert it for us. So we don't have to do sort of this heavy lift or some of this other stuff to actually manipulate the DOM. So it's a really popular tool. That's what React does. That's why it's really, really awesome. JSX is an optional syntax. So I'll show you whenever we created our React app, it'll do it as a .js. You can do it as a JS file. I would very much so encourage you to do JSX, and I'll tell you why when we get there. But it's a really, really good tool that we can, it's not even a tool. It's just this sort of out of the box with React that allows us to do a whole bunch of stuff and write in HTML and it get converted. If you want to learn more about JSX, there's an in-depth article right here. And here's that Babel translator that if you wanted to kind of play around with that and see under the hood what's going on, that is here as well as part of this additional resources within this syntactic sugar. Cool. Now, what I want to do is I've already done npx create react app, and we talked yesterday about Vite versus npx create react app. Again, we talked about the main thing. Can anybody remember the main thing I said before you do npx create react app? If this is an individual project, what is the main thing you have to do?
Initialize a Git repository.
Absolutely, Spencer. Thank you so much. You got to initialize a Git repository. Do you remember why?
Because React automatically creates one, so then you could possibly run into the issue of having a nested one?
Yeah, so specifically npx create react app creates one. React in itself, not necessarily, it's just using that package. npx create react app will create that hidden file. You guys remember when I did ls space -a, that showed my hidden file. Then if I try to go put it on GitHub, there will be an issue. If I'm trying to initialize another repository, then I have a nested repository. It's a big issue. So if you guys are doing this as an individual project each time to put on GitHub, make sure you first initialize your repository and then run npx create react app. Cool. So I've already done that. And this is what it did. This is what it gave me, not the class overview or the main JS, but everything from the README up. So what I think we'll do for the next maybe 5-10 minutes is go through these. I'm not going to go super in depth, but I want you guys to be familiar with what's going on and what some of the main things are doing. So when I do this, when I run this, we see this node modules. And we talked about this yesterday, but this is all of your dependencies. These are all of your tools that you have access to. It's a lot. If you are trying to zip a file, you need to make sure that you remove these. Can anybody remember what you use to remove it? What is the terminal? This is like a plus effort if you can do it. RM space -rf node modules. Yeah. So great job, guys. So that's what you would use to remove the node modules. Now, it also gives us this public folder, right? And so within this public folder, we're really not going to touch it. There is one thing we will touch, and that is this index.html. Now, if you remember back when I talked about having a single page application, I said that there is one HTML and we just take all the pieces and move it, right? We take off one component and we add another component, but we just have one static, if you will, HTML, right? Just one HTML file. Well, here it is. Here is our HTML file right here. The only time we will ever change this is I will use Bootstrap for me to make a form. So like next week when we're dealing with forms, I will show you how to bring in Bootstrap. I usually do a teaching on Bootstrap before. So before forms, I'll do like a Bootstrap office hour to kind of teach you guys how to use Bootstrap if you wanted to use it. It's not at all required, but I use it all the time. So I'll just want to teach you guys how to use it. The only time we'll change this index.html is when we want to add that in, but we'll talk about that next week. One thing I want to point out here is this div ID root div. This file is all we're loading. And this represents our app.js file right here, right? Oh, actually it is index.js, sorry. So what this is saying is const root equals react dom.create root document get element by ID root, right? And so what this is going to do, you don't need to understand exactly what's going on, but really what it's doing is we're saying, hey, we're going to get the element by ID of root within my index.html. So this guy right here. And then what we're doing is we are going to render. And then the big key thing we have here is app. This app.js is really where all of the magic is going to happen. This is where all of our stuff is going to live. Any sort of component that we are going to use is going to come off of app.js, and we'll as we get farther through it, we'll see how we sort of manage our components, and we'll even create a component today, right? But app.js is really sort of our parent file, if you will. And that's because right here, where this is just rendering my component of app right here. Now this is an app.js. You can make this as JSX if you want it. It's not really going to do anything. But whenever we create components, we will have a JSX, .jsx. But here is really where all of the magic is going to happen. We are going to live here. So if I want to show you guys how we can get this to start. So let me come here. Let me make this a lot bigger and clear this. I'm currently in my folder. Now I've created, if I say ls, I have created. Sorry, my dog was looking weird. I thought she was gonna have a seizure. She had one on Tuesday night, right after class. I've created my file, my main.js, and then we see this client. Now my client is my React, npx create React app, and I said client. The reason I called it client is because when we get to a full stack application, we're going to have our client and our server. So I called it client just so that way you guys get used to it and I don't just change it halfway. You can name it anything you want, but you see that this is my client folder. So if I cd into client, can anybody remember from a Mac perspective, what do I use? What terminal do I use, or what terminal command do I use to look inside of my client folder?
ls.
ls, yeah. So I'm gonna say ls, and you can see that this is my React project, right? Now, what if I wanted to start it? I just say npm start. And what it's gonna do is it's automatically gonna set up my deployment. And we're gonna get this beautiful looking rotating React symbol, right? If I look at my code, this is exactly what's going on, right? It says app.js, save and download, or save to reload. We see edit source app.js and save to reload. So this is exactly what we're showing, right? All of this information is exactly what we're showing. Somebody said it is ls to look, and then it's npm start once you've navigated. And this is what I always see students doing. Make sure once you create your React app, you then navigate into the folder you just created. If you try to on your parent, so in this case, lecture 3, if I try to run npm start, I'm going to get an error because it doesn't know what that is, right? That's not the build. I have to navigate into client, and then I can run npm start. That happens all the time. It's like almost like I don't know if it's your first time, it's kind of like a rite of passage to be like, why is this not working? It's like you're in the wrong folder. Oh no. So no worries on that if that was you. Cool. But we're able to see this image, this text, learn more about React, and all of that is happening right here, right? We've got this edit source app.js, save and reload. We have this logo, source logo. We've got this link right here. That way we can go to this, learn React. We have all this information there. I am going to kill it all. Get rid of it because we don't need it, right? There's also a app.css in my source. So if you wanted like all the colors and all that stuff, that's where that's coming from. But I'm going to get rid of it. When we're dealing with React and components, there's some really important pieces to know. We are dealing, there's 2 types of components, and we're going to talk about the second type in week 7 because it's more antiquated, but still in use. Like I have a student that already got a React job. They just finished last week. They already got a React job, but their company still uses the antiquated system. So they're like, well, I'm really glad that you guys still taught that because our company still uses it. But moving forward, this is what we call a functional component. The other one's called a class-based component. But again, we don't need to worry about that till week 7. We're just going to use functional components because that is kind of the standard now. So we've got this function and we're going to call it app. Now, what is important to note is 2 things. This here, app, always matches whatever you name it, whatever you name your component. Your component must always start with a capital letter. And so these 2 need to match, and we're going to use a snippet that's going to do it all for us. But just so you guys know, these 2 need to match. And then lastly, you need to export default, again, app. So these 3 names, this is the trifecta that have to work, right? The second big thing to know is we always have a return within my function, and our return must always have one parent element. So here we have this div, right? That's great. I can have things within my div and it works just fine, right? I can have some sort of header, or I can just have, I'm just going to create an H1 that's going to say hello world. I'm going to save this and go look. And now we see hello world. What I cannot do is have two parent. This cannot have a sibling. So I can't say like div. You're already seeing that there's an issue here, right? There's an issue with saying, no, 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 no. JSX expressions must have one parent element. So always make sure that you've got one parent. In this case, it is a div. What you could also have is what we call just a JSX fragment. And it just looks like this. This is what we call a JSX fragment. It's usually always going to be a div, but you could do this and this would work just fine as well. Like if I look at my code, the div is different because the div has different properties. And it is centered based off of this guy. Like we had this app and then our other div had that. So that's why it looks different, but this still works, right? We have this element, this JSX fragment, and we are good to go. The second or the third thing, I guess, that is unique and let's understand is that with JSX, when we're dealing with classes, we don't just put class, we have to put class name with a capital N. So if we're adding any sort of class, we are always going to put class name. We no longer in JSX can put class. Cool. So we've talked about the main things within this component. We've talked about the parents, right? It must only have a parent. It can never have two siblings. It can have, like if I had another div, like if I had this, but around it, I had this. Like, I just want to make sure that you guys know, you guys can do this. Like you can have siblings as long as there is a parent. As long as there's one parent, right? This will not be a downfall, I promise, because I'm going to show you a little expression, a little snippet whenever we create our first component that's going to do it all for us. And we're going to be living the high life. Okay. Cool. So we got this. Let's get rid of all this junk. Oops, let's go there. Cool. Great. Now I want to investigate a little bit more. Oh, class name. Yeah. I'm going to investigate a little bit more. And then we'll actually build out our first component. The other thing it creates is a .getIgnore. Now, when we are pushing our code to GitHub, which again, I'm going to encourage you guys to get practice with that. Start pushing your stuff to GitHub, because when you get to projects and algorithms, regardless if that's your next stack or not, you have to use GitHub, right? Because you have a group project that you have to manage. So get familiar with it now. You're already going to be like trying to prepare to get a job and doing a project and doing algorithms. And it's like, don't add one more thing. Take this time now. You have me to help you. You have other people. You have John, you have Jason, if he's in here, to help you. So start doing that now. But what this getIgnore does is whenever we end up pushing to GitHub, we can say, I want you to ignore all of this stuff. Now, most of this stuff doesn't matter for what we're doing. Really, the big one is this node modules, right? We're going to eventually, once we get to week 5, introduce something called .env, so environment variables. We're not there yet, so it doesn't matter. But we're just saying, hey, I want you to not include node modules. So when you push this to GitHub, you're not going to have any node modules in there. Cool. The other big file that's really important is this package JSON. Now, this package JSON is built for you, right? When we run npx create React app. But the big thing is if we ever delete our node modules, we do the rm space -rf space node modules. You guys saw that I could re-download those with npm install. Right? All I have to do is navigate to the folder and run npm install. The reason we can do that is because of this file right here. What this does is it lays out a blueprint of what is required in order to run this program. This is going to be huge, especially when you get to cloud computing and you want to run all of this stuff and you want to put this on a server. you need some sort of file to say, cool, now go and get everything I need. And instead of you having to go in and manually do all this and then forgetting something and it doesn't work and you have to figure it out, you want to keep this package JSON here. So never delete your package JSON. So if anything gets deleted, like your node modules, you just have to run npm I or npm install. It's going to come here and it's going to download all of your, what we call dependencies, what you are needing in order for this project to run. It's another great tool as well when we start downloading other npm packages, when we start downloading like eCrypt, when we're wanting to hash passwords, or we're wanting to use Axios or any other thing, in order for us to be like, oh, did I download that? Did I already install that? Well, I don't really want to install it again if I haven't, or if I already have. We can just come into our package JSON and look and say, is it here? Okay, great. Because anytime we npm install something, it's going to go into our package JSON and write that as a dependency. So it's a great tool to just know, well, what am I currently using right now with this project? Any questions on this? This other stuff, you don't really, again, we're going to deal with this index.js in like week 5, I think. We're going to add one thing, and that's like an optional thing. But other than that, you don't need to worry about tests. If we wanted to test our code, we could do this. Tests are great. It's not what we're doing right now. And then within our public, these are just like logos. So if we wanted that spinning logo, that's what we would do. Robots.txt. I don't even know what exactly that file does. I'm assuming it is like a crawler or something, but the main files for this are your index.html, that's within your public. That's the only one that you'll ever touch. And that's just if we add Bootstrap. If not, then you'll never touch it. Your app.js is where everything lives. Your index.js is an important tool for actually injecting and showing your component of app. One thing to note too is when we actually start running this and we're doing certain things, like let's see if we can inspect, see what happens. I don't think, yeah, I was gonna say, I don't think anything's gonna happen. When we start messing with stuff, we're gonna see stuff put twice, like you'll see it, like a kind of ran twice, if you will, like if we're dealing with state or something. And that's because we have strict mode on. I don't know exactly why strict mode makes things run twice, but if we were to get rid of this is like part of development, then it would only run once. So when we get there, I'll show you, but that's because of strict mode. And then that's it. And then your get ignore and your package JSON. Are there any questions on sort of the setup overview before we jump into components?
Yeah, question about very much just the setup.
Mhm.
Is so I don't know if you went over this, but is this like a kind of automated thing that you activate to get all the specific files in the right order in their contents and all that?
Yeah, great question, Cameron. So when I run npx create react app, all of this is made for me. I don't have to touch it. This is out of the box. All I've done is run npx create react app, and all of this is made for me, including the get ignore. So you don't have to touch it. I just wanted you guys to be familiar with what some of the main files were, but this is all done for you. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Cool. Any other questions on this? We're doing good on time, so.
Can you tell me where, can you point out where in the learning platform it goes over the NPX?
So if we have, let's see, create React app. So here in create React app, we have this npx create React app.
Got it.
Yep.
Thank you.
This is assuming you have Node, and whenever you download Node, it should download npm. And then just making sure your project name here can be anything. I called mine client because that's what we'll end up doing. And I would encourage you guys just to get used to calling it client. But you can name anything. Just make sure you do kebab casing.
So you recommended we initialize on Git before creating this, right?
Yeah. So, and that should talk about it here, but you want to make sure that you first initialize your parent. So my parent is this guy, lecture 3, right? Within lecture 3, and once I've navigated to lecture 3, that's when I say npx create React app client. So while in lecture 3, that's where I initialize on get first. If not, we can remove the hidden get file, like that can be removed. If there's really an issue, like if you forget, then we can remove it, but it's always a better way to do it. So that's just by, let me just cancel this. And the way you cancel it's just Control C. So here is my main project, right? If I type ls, it's got my client, my main.js, my class overview markdown file. Here is where I would get init. Then after I run get init, then I would run npx create React app client. So in theory, you should run it when there's only main.js and class overview. Get init, then do client, and then npx create React app will see that its parent, which is lecture 3, already has a .get file and it won't create one. Any other questions?
Yeah, is this in the lecture from yesterday? How to create it and walk through it? I don't recall.
The npx create React app?
Yeah.
Yes.
I remember you going over it, but I guess I wasn't really paying attention because I was trying to get the commands for Windows.
Yeah, I did go through that. It's a pretty simple walkthrough. In the regards of like, let's pretend that client wasn't here. All I would say is cool. Lecture 3, I would say npx create React app, and then I say client. I would press enter, and then this would create my React app.
Awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, of course. And then once I run that, that's what gets me all of this stuff. Now, as a reminder, if I were to say npm start here, whilst in lecture 3, I'm going to get this error. Oh no, I don't have this. It's because I first have to navigate to client. So I say cd client, then I say npm start. And then now I have this working just fine. It's a very common error. Okay, so now we're going to create our own component. Before we do that, there is some extensions that I want you to think about getting. It is, I can't remember which one it is. So this JavaScript code snippets, whenever you're dealing with these extensions, you want to make sure that you are checking to see how many times it's downloaded and how many stars there is. If you've got something downloaded like 2 or 3 times, maybe you think about not doing that. You want to make sure it's like crowdsourced, right? And popular there. And the same thing, this is the big one, is the ES7 plus React Redux React Native snippets. So download this one as well. I'm going to be using this every single time. So make sure you download this. You might have to like restart or refresh, if you will, your VS Code once you download it, but make sure you download this. Let me see if I'll put this in Discord. So extensions for React. And then let me put this guy. Híjole, what the heck? Whatever. And then, oh, this is just a linter. Linter's just going to tell you, this is not a bad thing to have either. It's just going to tell you if there's, Microsoft, you're killing me, bro. Love Microsoft because of the OpenAI stuff, but it's like, come on, dude, you're better than that. A linter's just going to be like, hey, you might have an error here, but it can be annoying as well. So it can be helpful, but also annoying. Okay. So once you get these snippets, it's going to be really, really helpful. And you're going to see why, or these extensions, you'll see why here in just a second. So if I want to create another component, right? Because I don't want to do everything all here. right? I don't want all the time. I want to be able to have different pieces that I can take out and put on and take out and kind of move, right? And so I'm going to create separate components. That's the power behind React. And remembering that if one thing changes on a specific component, instead of going to have to change it, on 20 different HTML pages, I just change it within my one component and then it's changed for good. So the way we're going to do it is we're going to go into this source folder right here. And I'm going to create a new folder called components, lowercase c, components. Now within this, I'm going to create a file. And what is the big thing with the naming convention that I said earlier that it has to happen when you have a component? See who's paying attention.
Capital
Dr.
letter.
Bob.
Capital letter to start every word.
Absolutely. So first
I think I just stole that answer from somebody.
component dot. And so I could say .js and that would work just fine. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here. I'm going to rename this and I'm actually going to name it .jsx. And the reason is because if I do .jsx, hey, you're going to see this dope little React sign right here. But then what it's also going to do is it's going to allow me to just write HTML. And if I have an autocomplete on HTML, it'll automatically do that. Versus with the JS file, you can still write the HTML just fine in the same way that this is, but it's not going to autocomplete as easy. So I created this first component, JSX. Now this is where the snippets are going to come in handy. I could go in and I could write a lot of this stuff myself, right? Or I say RAFCE, find out what it means to me, right? So RAFCE, and it automatically does it for me. And so let's walk through exactly what's going on. Now, this is created as a function within this app. We can make it an arrow function if we wanted. But just by default, it doesn't because I was reading on why they don't. And it's because not everything within React has been converted to an arrow function. And so it's still within the documentation. It still shows it this way. So it hasn't been updated, which I think is a stupid excuse, but here we are. But what we're going to do is we are going to have our component. Now you don't have to use RAFCE. If you wanted to write this by hand, you totally could, but we're saying import React from React. Now you actually don't have to have this anymore. It'll still work now with this newer version of React. Or with one of the more recent versions of React. I don't think the newest, but you don't have to have this, but it'll automatically import it and it'll be fine because we're going to still use this next week when we talk about state. We're going to have to import that anyway. So it's okay to leave it. It's not going to hurt anything. Here we have an arrow function, right? And it's called first component. Now remember, this must match this. And then this export default must match this as well. And then within there, all we have is our first component, right? We have some div called first component, and I'm going to write an H1. Perfect. And so I'm going to actually just have this as first component. Perfect. I have my parent. Remember, this always has to have a parent. Yeah, thank you, Spencer. It's RAFCE. I always do like the RAFCE. Find out what it means to me, like the Aretha Franklin RESPECT. I don't know why that makes me remember it, but I've got this H1 in here now. Perfect. We are good to go. Now, if I look at my code, I can't see anything, right? Because my component, though we've created it, we haven't taken that component and put it on our index HTML or what we view that as. Now, we don't actually have to go into our index.html and do anything. Remember, this index.js goes in there to our index.html, finds that element by ID, which was a div, and it renders this component here. So if I want to show my first component, I just have to go to my app.js, and then I have to just say first component. Now, I like to do the autocomplete. You don't have to, but I'll show you. Here's why. Is because in order for this to work, I first am saying, here's the component and where I want you to put it. Second thing is I have to import it. Now, if I do the autocomplete, it will automatically import, and that's not even a GitHub Copilot. That's just I think an ES7 import thing, where it will import the first component from, and then saying dot, meaning, okay, this same area, then go into the components folder. And within your components folder, I want you to find the file that is first component. Now, it doesn't have to have JSX that's sort of interpreted. So it's just grabbing my first component. So I'm importing, and now I have access to it. And if I were to look at my code, great. Now I see my code of first component. We have officially created our first component, and we have rendered it on this guy right here on our app. So you guys are officially React developers. You've officially created a component, and you have rendered it and put it on your app there. Are there any questions on this, on the components, on what we just did? Any questions at all? Cool. Now let's say within my first component, instead of it just saying, I want it, first component, I could say hello. And I wanted it to say first name and last name from first component. Oops. Component. Yeah. But I wanted to be able to pass in some information to this component. I wanted to give this component access to some information. This is where props comes in. Now you can sort of think about props as a parameter that's being passed through, but really it's just passing off some information to this component, right? So what I can do is I can go here, and within this first component, when I'm calling my component, I need to give it access to whatever I want to give it access to. So in this case, what I can say is first name equals, and then I just have to maybe create my first name. So let's just say like Will. This is very basic. And as we get more complicated, and once we introduce state, you'll sort of maybe get a better understanding of props. But it's just really passing in some information. So I'm saying, hey, first component, I need to go into my components folder. I need to grab my first component so that I can render it. But while you're there, go ahead and give first component first name and not second name, sorry, last name. Silly goose. In case it needs it, or in this case, we say we know it needs it because it wants to show first and last name right here. So it says, okay, give it access to it, because in order for it to run the way it needs to, it needs access to this. So if we're going to do that, there's two things we could do. I could say props, just like this. Oops. Props just like this. And then what I can do is well, first off, let's just console log props and see what it gives me. Cool. So right now, if I refresh, I console log, and this is where that 2 part comes in. Remember when I said the React strict mode, why it gives us 2, that's why it's double in my index.js. But I see that it passes in an object, and that object is first name and last name, right? The key of first name and last name with a value of Will and Calhoun. Cool. So now I can, I don't need a backtick. Nope. The only time I do a backtick is whenever I want to show some information in another way. But now what I could do is let's go ahead and first and foremost, what I can do is because this is an object, I could say something like this, where I say props, because I call that props, dot first name and props. I guess I don't want to leave that. Props that last name. So now I'm grabbing this object, right? I'm inheriting this first component is getting this object. And we're saying, cool, go get that value at the key first name and go get the value at the key last name. And so it's going to say, hello, Will. Oh, I put and. Whoops. Doesn't make sense. Hello, Will Calhoun. Oh, I need to refresh. How silly. Okay. Hello, Will Calhoun from first component. So now I've passed it some information. And then I've taken it from our props and I'm able to now show it. Now, one thing to know is props can only travel downwards. Only travel downwards, meaning this app.js, let's get some visualizations going because we've been doing this visualizations for a little bit and you guys like them. So let's do this. Our app.js is our parent, right? And currently we've got another component that we're calling within my app.js. Let me do this as app.js. And this is our first. Because app.js is the one calling first component, it is the parent of my first component. It is the parent of my first component. What that means is if I have props, they can only travel downward to my children. I cannot pass props from first component up to app.js. I can render them and show them, which we just saw. I cannot do that. Right? They can only be passed downward. And we're going to talk about this when we are talking about state, and we're going to what we call lift state. So don't worry about it if this is super confusing. But go ahead, Cameron.
If I had like a dictionary with a bunch of like bunch of information, where I had like, first name, last name, but it was like multiple users or like whatever, would I put that into where this is right now?
Yeah, so you would say const users equals, like if we had something like this, but it was like, maybe we had like a Will. Had this, and then maybe we had another one. Josh would be Josh Calhoun. Maybe we had this.
Yeah.
Right. I could just create like all users equals users and pass that in. Oh, sorry. It needs to be in a curly bracket. If we're passing in an information, so like if we're passing in this, like if we're passing in a variable in this case, then I could then pass this in, and now all users gets passed in, and then I can iterate through users on my first component if I wanted. So if I were to look at this now or refresh, let's see. Oh, I'm not console logging props anymore. Let me look at that. Cool. You see that the props I have access to are all users, which is all these guys, and I have access to first name and last name. So that's how you would do that. And we'll do that a little bit. when we start dealing with state. And that's really where the traveling to a certain area, traveling down is important. For right now, as long as you can pass in props, you're good to go. Now, there's another way and a easier way, in my opinion. So we could do props.first name. We could also destructure and say like const first name, last name equals props. And instead of having to say props.first name, I could just say first name and last name. This would do the exact same thing. I still have Will Calhoun. Still works just like normal. But alas, there's an even easier way to do it. Is we can, because we're using an arrow function, within this, I can actually destructure. So just like this. But wait, there's more exactly. So it still works perfectly. Now, one thing I really want to point out is when you are destructuring, this must match this. They have to match the same. Right? This name, if I have it as like this, gives me an error because it's not defined. It doesn't know, right? Or this guy, right? So let's make sure that these are the same name, and then you're good to go. So we saw a couple different ways. You could just say props and then say props dot with the key. You could destructure and say const first name, last name equals props. This is another popular way to do it. It's getting mad because it's saying you've already destructured. And then the easiest way to do it is actually just destructuring here when we have an object. And then if we destructure, then we can just call it here instead of having to say props dot. And if we wanted to call some information within JSX, we don't have to have the backtick and we don't have to have the $sign. That's a template literal. We don't have to do that. We can just do a curly bracket and then we call that actual value. Now, one thing I do want to point out, and you just saw it here on this app.js, if you've got some sort of functionality, and we're going to start having some functionality when we deal with state, that always goes above your return statement. So we're going to have a lot of functionality eventually that'll be like between my function call and the start of my function and then my return. That's where our functionality. So when we're dealing with state or we're dealing with some other submit handlers or change handlers or validations or any sort of functions that we create, that's all going to be between the opening of my function and the return. And then we'll have that here. Okay. That is it for what I have. Surprisingly, we did it with 2 minutes left. Are there any questions on what anything you need to know?
I have a question.
Yeah.
For the first name and last name, for the value, is it need to be in the curly braces or it will be okay like that?
So this will be okay because this is sort of a hard-coded portion, right? I'm just saying I want to pass the string because this is a value or because this is a variable. That's when it has to be in a curly bracket.
Okay. All right.
Great question. But let's see if I'm going to test something. I don't know, but the best way to do something is test. If I said users dot will dot first name. Again, using dot notation, we saw this yesterday. I'm going into my users object. I've got a key of will, but will in itself is an object. So I can dot notation into the other key of first name. And then I could do the same thing. Let's just keep this here and we'll see if it still works. And it does, it works just fine. So if we have the actual string, then you don't need the curly brackets, the little curly boys. But if you are wanting to call some information from within your file, you do need the curly brackets. Just wanting to go through because I'm looking at wanted to go through a few things. This is just because I think Cameron asked if we wanted to pass in this information. This is our props, right? So this value is basically, we saw that whenever we do first component, what it receives within props when we console logged it, this creates a key, a first name, and a value of whatever this is. It creates a key of last name and a value of Calhoun. It creates a key of all users and a value of this user's object. So when we come to first component, I can destructure just like this because it's just an object, right? We just saw because it creates a key and a value pair. But these keys, this is saying this value is this key, right? So that's what we're associating the two there. Again, if I wanted just to say props, then this works just fine. And I'm destructuring this way, works the exact same. That's very okay. And then lastly, if I wanted to not even do this and I want to say props dot first name, props dot last name, it is the most inefficient way to do it for sure, but you can, especially if at the beginning, this is a little bit challenging. I understand that it feels a little bit like we were like, oh, everything is perfect. And then like, oh, okay, yesterday was a little bit crazy. And then now it's like, oh my gosh, what the heck? I promise you, we're going to get plenty of practice with this. This is what I was talking about with like, hey, this does ramp up a little bit, but I am here. John is here. Gray will be here and we will be able to process through this. And I promise you, you will be able to get it and understand it.
Hey, Will,
So-
there was a question asked in the chat.
Yeah.
Just confirming, so the data you want to pass lives in your app.js file, but the function working with that data lives in your component file. I don't really know how to answer that question, so to pass that on to you. If you need me to restate it, I can. They DM'd me. So
Yeah, if you could restate, what is the exact question? I'm sorry, I'm trying to find it in chat.
word for word, just confirming. So your data you want to pass lives in your app.js file, but the function working with the data lives in your component. I will copy and paste that.
Oh,
chat
I see
for-
this from Jennifer.
Yeah.
So your data you want to pass lives in the app.js file, but the function working lives in your component file. So not to confuse you guys more, but we could add in another component. Just want to hammer out that this is just passing information down. That's all that's happening, right? So I could have second component dot JSX. And this second component could have an H1. It says hello. And we could then, it could render within my first component. And so that means anytime my first component is rendered, what's happening? Anytime my first component is rendered, it will also render my second component. And then we are going to say first name equals let's see. Don't say this. Okay. And then I could say again, so then we can pass it in. So what the data just in this example, oh shoot, lives in app.js, right? It just currently lives there. I could also do something like this. Save that. This isn't going to work because it's going to now say. It doesn't have to live in my app. It could live here. And I could also pass in all users equals users. So it doesn't necessarily matter where the actual data lives just for props. We can just pass it in as long as we have access to it within this prop or within this component, sorry. So if I have users that only lives within this component, I can still pass it to my child component here, right? I can still pass it through all users. And if I were to look, there's an issue, but not exactly sure what it is. Probably not liking something I'm doing. Oh yeah, there was no issue. I can pass it through. And then here, if I wanted to, let's just say props just to show something. Okay. So what this is doing is this is my second component. It's taking in props and it's still getting all of this information for props, right? We are then destructuring first name and all users. So now I have access to first name, hence why it's able to say will. But then I'm also able to grab this all users. All users lives within my first component. So as long as you're passing from component to component, you can, as long as you have access to the data, whether it comes from the app.js, hence we have first name, I'm able to pass that and use that here, then able to pass it in and then still use that here. You can do that. Doesn't matter where the data necessarily lives, as long as I'm passing it in. And somebody asked a question, so can you nest components? You absolutely can nest components, and we will all the time. Remember how we're talking about like our dashboard yesterday, where we said if we maybe have a dashboard and we have two nav bars, let's pull this up. Maybe I've got, this is my main project, and I've got two nav bars. And then I have other piece of content. These are all, if I've just got a dashboard component and maybe two separate nav bars and components, they're all just nested within my dashboard, whatever I'm currently rendering based off of my route, which is way too advanced and we don't need to worry about it. But yeah, we can do exactly that. We can nest components. You just have to be aware of when you nest components, wherever, like, because I nested the second component within my first component, wherever first component is called, whenever we call that component, it's called mounting it, meaning that we are going to get this first component. Then we, once this is mounted, it's going to go through and it's going to get all this information. It's going to show what it needs. Then it's going to mount the second component and actually show that information. So then it's going to go here, find this component, and then show it within my first component. So this is the kind of the power behind it, right? Is if I ever need to change first component, like I want to add in an exclamation point, hope you are well. Now, whatever component is showing this component will reflect it. So if I even had a third component, this will be my last thing I do today. Third component. And this is the reusability of why React is so dope. Is I could say hello from third component, and then I could say second component. Now, second component needs some information, right? It needs some props. And so let's pretend, just for example's sake, that we don't have this. This is not a thing. I say it's just a first name, right? So that's what second component needs. Let's just say. Hello, first name. In order for this to run, it needs first name, just like a function, right? In order for a function to run, it needs the correct things. So if I said first name equals John, and then in my app called third component, ooh, I don't want this. Now it says, this is my app. I have pulled in my first component. My first component brings in, it looks like I have some sort of backslash, brings in my second component, right? Because it's saying second component, hello from the first component. Boom, crushed it. Then it says, hello, Will, hope you are well, because my first component calls second component, passes in first name. First name, in this case, is coming from right here. So then second component gets, hello, Will, hope you are well. Then app.js renders my third component, which then says, hello from third component. And we're still able to access my second component. But in this case, we said first name is actually John. So it says, hello from John. So this component's now reusable, right? I can use it in a bunch of different ways. And you can see I can even change the data if I wanted to, depending on what I need that component for. Let me see all these console logs. So I hope that didn't confuse you more than it helped. I was just trying to show the flexibility of components and the reusability. They don't have to all come from app.js. This second component could never be called in app.js, but if it is nested within my first and my third component, it's still accessible and visualized. But now again, you can see the powers. Like I just have to create a nav bar and then I can use it wherever I want within my program, anywhere. And then if I need to update it, I just go to that component, I update what it says, and then we're good to go. So it's pretty sweet. Okay. So I'm done teaching. Let me go through. Is everything linked to app just automatically or by import? So somebody, Tabitha, is asking, do we have a different way of using that here? So yeah, if you're wanting to use, so with your app.js, you just import the .css there. So if you had like a first component CSS, like if you had a folder called like CSS or component CSS, you would just import at the top and then would have access to all the class names that you created. In this case, app.css is all of this CSS. But this is just coming from whenever we created npx create React app. This is what automatically is created for us. So it's not like we did any of this.
Okay, so the app.css is already automatically there.
Yeah, it's created within.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. But if I had an additional CSS, I could just import it right here. It'd be just fine.
Okay, so when you pulled up this one, the app.js, by like just adding everything from React, the import for .app.css, did you put that in there manually?
Nope, it was already in there. Remember when we started and it had that spinning React wheel and it had like that color and it said like, hey, if you want to look at this, here's the documentation. It already comes with that CSS just out of the box with npx create React app. And the two things it comes with is this logo, which I don't even have anymore, but it's importing this from logo SVG. So it's the logo here. And then it's also importing this CSS. Now I could in theory delete both. I keep the CSS only because the CSS just text align centers. And so when we're looking, that's why this is text align center. If I were to come here and comment this out, my code goes directly to the left because I no longer have CSS attached to it.
Okay, maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit. So if I wanted to like mess with the CSS portion of this, I could just go in like I normally would do in any kind of style sheet and just mess with the app.css to change things on my app.js.
Yeah. So yeah. So you could just change this CSS. And if you wanted to create another CSS for like your components, you could do that as well. Or if you just wanted to have a main CSS file, if you're not going to go crazy with it and just add a class here, then you could just, as long as you imported, so like import, what did we call it? Import, what was it? Yeah, if we just had this, then you could apply a specific class name to this component here. Like if you, you know, created like some class, you know, dot some space class, you could do that.
Okay, and then when we use the app.js and we put the less than or more than signs on either side of our second component, it automatically imports that component. You do not have to manually put that in.
When we are bringing in components, not always, like if, I don't know if you saw that mine auto completed. I think that one is a GitHub Copilot thing. So normally if I were to bring in like a second component, I don't believe that that's not, but if I were to do it this way, you can see that I go perfect. It'll automatically bring it in, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And then I think it's mine for mine, it's GitHub Copilot that if I wanted to like import second component, that is GitHub Copilot.
Okay.
Hey, Will, I know you mentioned it at the beginning. Did you touch on why to make it a .jsx rather than a JS file?
I did. It is, let me get rid of this. It's all because that way you can use your like emit complete in a lot of your HTML tools.
Okay.
On your JSX file. So like auto completing an H1 or doing some of that HTML stuff, JSX will kind of pick up on that. And so you can write HTML just like you normally would, and your VS Code will come in and kind of fix it just like it normally would. Compared to JS, it won't.
Noted. That was
But
more of
usually-
a personal question.
Yeah, usually it doesn't. Yeah. So you could actually, I mean, again, you could rename this to a JSX and this would work the exact same way. You see that it's doing the same thing.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay. Looking at the chat. That made things clear. Cool. Have a great weekend. Oh, thanks, John. Yeah, I would say, Nandor, it's up to you. It's personal preference. I like using a JSX file again because of the autocomplete, but if you want to use them all as JS, good on you. Yep. Thanks, Spencer, for doing that. Cool. That is all I have. I will stick around if there's any other questions. Other than that, I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. Don't forget your discussion questions and your core assignments. Other than that, I hope you guys have a great weekend.